I died when I was 10. I felt like someone stabbed me with a knife. All I wanted was for the pain to stop. And suddenly it did.
Can you start chest compressions?
I died when I was just a kid.
Mom, Chip hit me.
It all happened so fast.
Chip!
It felt like a really scary roller coaster. My mom was screaming at us to unbuckle our seatbelts. She tried to help me unbuckle mine, but the water got to me first.
I died when I was 16.
Yo, Renee. What's up? I like that necklace. Let me see it.
Hey, leave alone.
Touch me.
Your mother.
Your face. Loser.
Maybe I'm not such a loser if they like me.
Over 7 million people have reported having near-death experiences. Many more don't report them. The case studies we will scientifically investigate are accurate medical accounts of people who are clinically dead. Their names have been changed to preserve their anonymity. If near-death experiences might be influenced by our perceptions, and our perceptions might be influenced by our culture, why not examine case studies where the subjects have had the least time to be influenced by culture? Children.
I told my teacher that I didn't feel well and I wanted to go see the nurse. But I think she thought I was trying to get out of taking the test.
Miss Shipley, may I please see the nurse? I don't feel so good.
Why don't you take the test first? You can see the nurse after. You don't want to get a 0, do you? You may begin. Kid, what's wrong? Are you okay? Where's it hurt?
Is she okay?
I felt like someone stabbed me with a knife. I don't remember what happened next.
Just in case you have a boy.
My mom was pregnant at the time, and her 2 best friends were giving her a baby shower.
Oh, hang on 1 second. I think that's Jen.
Hello? Is this? What? Which hospital? Okay. I got it. Thank you.
Years later, my mom told me that when she got this phone call, that she had this strange premonition that I was already dead. Turns out, she was right. All I wanted was for the pain to stop. And suddenly it did.
Can you start chest compressions?
felt like a cloud looking down on my body. I was just there, watching. Everything that was happening in the hospital room no longer seemed important. I remember seeing a doorway of light on the wall. I could feel the light. It was warm, very warm, and I was drawn to it. And before I knew it, I was falling down a dark tunnel. Someone was there with me. I couldn't see him, but I could hear his voice, loud and clear. I felt safe with him. He led me through another tunnel. And I was walking, but I couldn't feel my feet touch the ground. Another being, who I couldn't see, took me into another room. And that's when I met him. At the time, I thought he was Jesus or something, but now I'm not so sure. Whoever he was, I trusted him. He didn't speak to me, but I could hear everything he wanted me to know. He wanted me to know that it wasn't time for me to die yet. And then he wanted me to watch something on what looked like a TV screen. What I was watching was my life. I saw my future. But he said I would never remember it. The one thing he said that I'll never forget is that nothing can happen before it's time.
You're gonna be okay. You're gonna be okay.
Whoever he was, he made me know that I was going to have a baby brother. It was me who decided to come back. Well, my mom had no idea what the sex of her baby was going to be when all this happened. So when I told her that she was going to have a boy, she said, "Well, we don't know that yet, dear, but just remember, life is a blessing." I was right, of course. She did have a boy. But he turned out to be more of a dweeb than a blessing. Who knows? Maybe that's why I'm here.
A near-death experience, or NDE, refers to a broad range of experiences that generally takes place after a person has been declared clinically dead. Now that medical science has the ability to literally pull people from the edge of death, more and more NDE case studies are being reported. Is their consciousness beyond life as we know it? Or is NDE a dying brain's desperate attempt to make sense out of life and death? Some researchers think they know the answers to these questions. When we come back, we'll take a look. Most of us want to believe there is life after death, but how can we believe in something that can't be proven right or wrong? Since the dawn of science, there have been many theories about consciousness and whether it exists after death. Believe it or not, we might be getting closer to finding out the answer. Many scientists believe the NDE phenomenon is a neurobiological event brought on by a right temporal lobe dysfunction that distorts perceptions and malfunctions while the brain is in the process of dying. According to some scientific reports, the brain then does what it can to attempt to reconstruct a model of the universe from its limited sensory input. But does it really all come down to a disintegration of cerebral function as the macula in the eye continues to send images to a dying brain? What about the tunnels, lights, angels, and dead relatives? Are they all just projections manufactured by a dying brain that is trying to maintain control as it begins to shut down? When I was a kid, whenever I had a question about science, I would always ask my brother Richard. The left side of his brain has always been more active than mine. His work as a scientist at Cornell University's high-energy synchrotron source is changing what we know about structural biology. Dr. Melvin Morse was named one of America's top pediatricians and Woodward and White's best doctors in America. Dr. Morse is widely acknowledged as one of the leading experts on NDE in children. He conducted the most recognized NDE research done on children in the U.S., the Seattle study. Researchers like Dr. Morse and Dr. Gillilan are often forced to defend their ideas to colleagues that have opposing theories. Their reputation is their livelihood. That's one of the reasons why science continues to evolve, and why we'll learn something from two doctors who most likely will never agree.
The brain constructs a model of reality all the time. That's what brains do, and not just during near-death experiences, but when we're thinking, when we're dreaming. The mind is taking sensory input and creating a coherent story that it can use to predict what's going to happen next. And that's an enormous advantage that has made us so successful as a species. Our ability to think in abstract terms and our ability to look at a shadow in the forest and say, is that a tiger or is that a man with a weapon or is that just a shadow, and make really good decisions about that. Now, the brain doesn't always get things right. And I think that it's important to realize that human minds make mistakes. What we have in our brain is just an approximation of what is outside of our body.
The brain itself is it's creating a sense of reality from basically an illusion of what reality might be. It's creating something that is kind of like what reality really sort of might be like. We don't actually see the objective reality of life. We assume primarily what it is.
There's been a lot of discussion about the temporal lobe epilepsy and so forth, seizures, and some of the very peculiar phenomena that people experience when they're having a malfunction of that part of the brain that controls things like language and abstraction and whatnot. Similarly, there's an even more exciting part of the brain called the angular gyrus, or the temporal parietal junction. And this is an area that synthesizes, that takes the visual and the tactile senses that we have and combines them into a single coherent picture. And when this is malfunctioning, there are some very bizarre things happen that sound a great deal like the kinds of things that happen to people when they're having out-of-body experiences.
I was involved in a lot of split brain research studies when I was at Johns Hopkins. And sure enough, when we would present information to one side of the brain, the other brain would seamlessly invent a story. If we dripped water on the hand on the one side of the brain, the other side of the brain would tell us it was raining outside and believe it to be true. That is not what you see in the near-death experience from children. And I'll give you an example. One young girl that I resuscitated, we had to put a needle in her heart to restart her heart. So that's near death by anyone's criteria. Her short-term memory's gone. She has no memory of being in the hospital or going home. She just has one isolated, fragmented memory in which she says that her grandmother was smiling at her. And then she said to me, and then I was back. And I said to her, what do you mean you were back? And she goes, that's what I've been trying to figure out.
I don't know a single skeptic, not one, who has researched the entire near-death experience. When I say the entire near-death experience, I'm going to say the entire near-death phenomenon, which includes the experience and the after effects. There's not one out there who has looked at the whole thing at once, plus all of the after effects, plus the effect on significant others. Not one.
Research indicates 1/3 of our brain might be involved in the NDE process. Some scientists believe we create our own reality and that we might actually experience things before we perceive them.
99% of the near-death experience, in my opinion, is generated by our perceptions of what reality should be. So the great majority of it is. And unfortunately, I think that has a fact that's become obscured because when near-death research came about back in the 1970s and 1980s, then they were reacting to the concept, well, people think I'm crazy because I can talk to God, and then that whole debate then just put just a cloud over the entire issue. I have to tell you, I interviewed a little 5-year-old girl, and again, I'm so fortunate. It's the first time I've been, that they've told their experience to anyone. And I asked her, I said, well, why haven't you told your parents this? Why didn't you tell anybody? And remember, these are patients that we prospectively identified. So, to tell you, to go back to my research design, which is important, we did not put an ad in the paper, did somebody have a near-death experience, but instead we systematically interviewed survivors of cardiac arrest. And the parents of this little girl told me, no, she's not had an experience. And yet when I interviewed her, she said she had. And I said, well, why haven't you told anybody? And she whispered to me, I didn't think you were supposed to be able to talk to God. So, even a 5-year-old girl knows, that there's this sort of a bias against it.
You guys are certainly doing the right things in terms of trying to reduce the number of variables. And the way I see it is by interviewing children, you have eliminated some of the variability. We're hoping that you have a more pristine view of what actually happened that people are reporting without putting layers of interpretation and so forth on top of it. From the viewpoint of sort of my materialistic way of thinking, this sort of makes sense. People are having some kind of a physiological thing that's maybe it's dramatic, out of body, something like that, and then they relate that in their own cultural context, and later as they relive that memory, they embellish it to try to impress. They want people to feel the way they did. And so they exaggerate a little bit to try and communicate. So that makes sense to me.
I'd like to add some fuel to your materialistic zeal. We studied near-death experiences in Japan, and we found exactly what you said. The Japanese adults and children come to a border, which is the island of Japan, that they frequently have, of course, all sorts of Japanese symbols and imagery. We studied, I studied near-death experiences in Africa, and I didn't hear the types of things that children in this country have told me. We heard things like going through pathways instead of noodles. We heard about gourds, and etc. So I can, and I think that people who are looking for this, well, but this person said it was Jesus Christ, but they're from Japan where they don't believe in Jesus Christ. I think those are people who are trying to impose their belief systems into this process as well. Scientific researchers are imposing their belief systems into the process.
If consciousness really exists outside of the, outside of the material realm in some fashion, what does it really tell us?
One thing it tells us is that consciousness persists in the last few minutes of life in a dysfunctional dying brain.
I think that's an extraordinary claim. It's nice that we see extraordinary claims once in a while in the scientific literature, but an extraordinary claim requires a lot more than one, even a landmark study.
What evidence is there for the materialistic claim that the brain creates consciousness?
Predominant view is a materialistic view, is it not?
That's true. I'm asking what evidence is there to support it?
In 1989, Tyler and his family were driving back home after a skiing trip. During the long ride home, Tyler's older brother Chip was entertaining the family by reading from a joke book he picked up at a convenience store along the way. They have no idea the road they have chosen will soon lead to tragedy.
What do you call wood that has nothing to play with?
What?
Board.
Oh man. Honey, you sure this is the right road?
Just go a little further. I think this is right.
Great, we're lost. You sure you know how to read a map?
Stop. How about this one? The nurse says to the doctor, "Doctor, the invisible man's here to see you." So the doctor says, "Tell him I can't see him right now."
Ah, you suck.
You suck.
Mom, Chip hit me.
I did not. You little wuss.
Mom!
Boys, settle down right now.
Mom, Chip hit me again.
Chip, what did I tell you about hitting your brother?
It all happened so fast.
Chip!
It felt like a really scary roller coaster. My mom was screaming at us to unbuckle our seatbelts. She tried to help me unbuckle mine, but the water got to me first. It only took a few seconds for the car to get completely filled up with water. My mom had to let me go.
Tyler's mother and brother made it to shore, but Tyler was still trapped in the car and submerged underwater.
Where's my baby? Where's
Everything's going to be fine.
Before long, she realized her husband never made it out of the car alive. He died in the crash, but she could never get over how real he seemed that moment on the river bank.
Don't worry. It'll be okay.
On the way back home from a skiing trip, Tyler's family's minivan skids off a bridge and has fallen 50 feet into a river. Tyler's mother and brother have made it safely to shore, but his father wasn't so lucky. Upon impact, his head hit the windshield and he died instantly. According to Tyler's mother, his father's spirit appears to her one last time on the riverbank. Perhaps his final mission was to comfort her, knowing the guilt she felt being unable to save her youngest son. By the time the paramedics arrive, Tyler's heart is no longer beating, and he is clinically dead.
I don't remember actually dying.
The paramedics do all they can to revive him, but it doesn't look good.
I just remember falling into what looked like a giant noodle. But it wasn't a noodle. Noodles don't have rainbows in them. I just kept falling until I got to the end of the tunnel. There were two pathways, and I just started running down one of them. At the end of the pathway, there was this huge garden, full of flowers. But the flowers were more like people than flowers. They were like a family of flowers. They were really beautiful and really alive. Here's where it gets even weirder. There was this really nice... The only way I can really describe him is to say that he looked like a really nice hummingbee. Anyway, he realized I was hungry and gave me orange juice and bread. After I was finished eating, I saw this other tunnel. I went down it, and at the end of the tunnel there was this huge castle. The doors opened for me, and I walked inside, and there were all of these columns, like in the Lincoln Memorial or something. When I was in the ambulance headed to the hospital, there was this old lady with me in the ambulance. I can't explain it, but I think it was my grandmother.
It's not your time yet, darling.
She died a year before all this happened. How do I feel about life after death? That's not an easy question. But I don't fear death now. You always live. You just go to another place.
A young man says to me, a 4-year-old boy says to me, "But was my near-death experience real?" He wants to know if when he thought he was dead and yet I was alive, whether the heaven that he saw was real. He saw a wonderful castle in a heaven. This grieving widow wants to know, but was my husband, who I know is dead, but he appeared to me so real, was that just some hallucination of my brain?
When you say real, it's not always clear to me what you mean or what the person listening to that interprets it to mean. And do they mean that, yes, all their visions were real? If you have that story that you have written about the young man who goes to animal heaven and the bee comes and feeds him orange juice, are you telling him, hey, that bee was real? Or are you telling him that experience you had where you saw a bee was real and that's okay? Can you clarify that?
I'm saying that that experience was real to you. This is a very difficult thing because we want reality to be objective. We want this chair that we're sitting on to be real. We want this color red to be real. But we know that the only reason this color is red is because all of us have consensually agreed that it's red. And if we got a theoretical physicist in the room here, he would be happy to tell us that even this chair isn't so-called real, that it's just a bunch of waveforms and fields, and that, you know, and you can get endlessly mired in the issue of what is real.
I would say that what people really want is to be believed, and they want someone to say, yeah, I understand what you're talking about.
Most of my motivation is answering the questions primarily of grieving parents. Did the dream I have about my dead child, was that real? And believe me, they are the worst skeptics you've ever seen because they don't want to be sucked into a false belief. They don't want to be placated. Someone who has lost a child, which is every parent's nightmare, they want to know, is this something that is scientifically respectable or not? And when they hear that we have a whole portion of our brain dedicated to allowing us to have these experiences, and when they hear that to the best of our ability we're localizing these experiences at the point of death, and when they hear that this is at least...
I want to interject for a minute that, I mean, I think that... Oh, go ahead.
When they hear all of that, then that gives them the courage, or that gives them at least permission to then find their own beliefs.
The brain isn't working. Explain all of this. Well, you can't.
My dad wasn't around a lot. He worked as a marketing consultant for a computer software company. And when he would come home from a trip, he'd always have a present for me. I loved my dad. I kept expecting him to walk back through the front door, but it never happened. Just when things couldn't get any worse, we moved to Baltimore. The high school I was enrolled in was a lot different than what I was used to. It was almost as if they expected you to drop out.
Is that Renee? Yo, Renee. What's up? I like that necklace.
Your necklace is really cute. Let me see it.
What's up?
Hey, leave alone, leave alone.
Touch me.
What's with you, man?
Loser. Your mother.
Your face.
You too.
Maybe I'm not such a loser if they like me. That's what I was thinking. So I decided to hang out with these guys. We were drinking, and it was fun at first. And then they raped me. All I wanted to do was to take a bath. So when I went home, that's what I did. I heard somewhere that if you slit your wrist in a bathtub, you die faster. And the water was warm, but I kept feeling colder. I remember feeling light as a feather, calm, very calm. I had the strangest feeling that my body was not needed. I didn't think I'd be missed.
Children, during their experience, will often see the effect their death will have on their family and choose to come back because they don't want to hurt their family. Well, believe me, the after effects can be tough to deal with. They can be so difficult to deal with sometimes that some people do attempt suicide afterward just to get back. Normally, a near-death experience is a suicide deterrent, but not always. With adults, about 5% attempted suicide to get back afterward. With children, though, 21%. We need to really look at children. Children do not integrate near-death experiences like adults do. They don't think like adults do. With a child, their logic is very different. Here's a child's logic. They're in this light-filled, beautiful, loving world with what most children call the people or the bright ones, and they're not breathing. When they're breathing, they're not in that world anymore. And they want to get back to that world.
I was floating. I could see and hear everything that was going on. Not really understanding why my mom was making such a big deal out of everything. Her voice began to fade, and I could hear a humming sound. Like a beehive, but really loud. And that's all I could hear. And everything went black. I began to travel through a dark tunnel. I could see a light at the end of the tunnel. I was traveling a great distance. It might have taken a week to get there, but time no longer seemed to matter. Gradually, there was no more darkness, and I was surrounded by a feeling of being loved. All the while, I was guided by this voice. And the voice was familiar to me, but I couldn't quite place it. It was like a distant relative, someone I'd always known, someone who'd always been there for me. But I couldn't really see her. I didn't question where I was or where I was even going. I already knew where I was. I was home. I like to think I was surrounded by angels. They were like waves of light, but only dense, like a liquid. It was like looking at reflections in a pond or something.
So when we're looking at the heaven-like experience, you know, scenarios of loving family reunions, reassuring religious figures or light beings and angels, validation that life counts. And I've noticed the subtlety here with people who have this kind of experience. It's almost invariably happens to those who most need to know how loved they are.
I was filled with a warm feeling of being loved, surrounded by light. All the while, this voice was guiding me. The voice kept with me, guiding me through a journey, and we observed what had been my life up to this point. Then the voice told me what I already knew, that I had to go back. I didn't want to come back, but the voice wouldn't let me stay. She wouldn't let me die.
You have to move up in a more enlarged and expansive view of self and world. You know, that's the spiritual. For some people, that's the religious. That's that divine part of us that we call the soul.
The late Dr. Carl Sagan. Dr. Sagan had a lot to say about the near-death experience. Needless to say, he was a skeptic, and he wasn't alone. Many physicists readily accept theories like the string theory, the M theory, or Einstein's everything theory, which are all based in beliefs in alternate universes. Why then are so many of them skeptical when a large portion of the population claim they've been there?
Physicists support things like string theory, which are, have attracted a wide amount of public attention. And on the other hand, near-death experience research seems to be, people are very skeptical of it. In physics, the problems are relatively, very focused. There are relatively few variables when you do an experiment, whereas in something in the social sciences or maybe on the far extreme, near-death experiences that depend upon subjective testimonies of individuals, the variables are just zillions and zillions. And so I think that what makes string theory is not just the fact that it's in some sense a simpler science. There is this mathematical framework that string theory isn't just some idea that someone came up with. There's actually, it fell out of the mathematics. The mathematics is suggesting, through this beauty and symmetry, people have said, hey, this idea of strings looks appealing. Maybe it's true. Whereas in the softer sciences like near-death experience, there really isn't that kind of mathematical framework. So I think the difference is somewhat justified.
There is, in fact, a reality that has no time and has no space. In fact, theoretical physicists, their mathematical model of reality is that all of this reality is without time and is without space. So when children say to me, I went to a place where I knew everything and time didn't exist, they're simply describing what theoretical physicists tell us is in fact the hard core of reality. And that's a fact. So there's no doubt that any of those things are true scientific facts. We just haven't looked at it that way before. Just as the human brain actually infers this very real-looking reality around us, scientists have inferred that there's something called dark matter. They can't directly see it, but by looking out into the cosmos and looking at the effects of gravity and how light comes to this earth and such as that, they can infer that there's a large amount of mass that's not accounted for. And so they call that dark mass, meaning that we can't see it directly with our scientific instruments. Well, it's not a matter of that this dark mass lives somewhere else on some other universe somewhere far away. No, this dark mass is interwoven into the fabric of what we call reality. It's all around us at all times. So there certainly is plenty of reality out there that is completely undefined. What can we learn from the dying experience that applies to us who are living? Well, everything. Everything has to do with that.
During Renee's near-death experience, she travels to a world where time doesn't exist. She is surrounded by loving beings that appear to her as reflections of light beyond a veil of water. All the while, she is guided by a familiar voice of a dead relative. For some reason, the voice won't let her die. Once she has seen this other world, the voice takes her back home.
The next thing I remember was seeing the face of my mother. She wouldn't let me die either. For the first time, I realized how much she loved me. Maybe that's one of the best things that happened from all of this.
There has been quite a bit of research on the after effects of near-death experience and showing that there seem to be benefits. People seem to have benefits.
It's good for you to talk to God, there's no doubt about it.
Many people have the ability to actually, when they've been through a loss, to eventually turn that loss into a win. And it doesn't surprise me at all to hear that people who have been through a near-death experience, a very traumatic experience, also have that kind of thing happen to them over time. It's just another form of loss and trauma. And
wait, not just another form of loss, but that spirituality, some sort of spiritual understanding or vision, has planted that seed of healing.
We humans are survivors. We find ways to turn loss into gain, and that's why we're here. That's why we evolved and are so successful.
I missed a year of school because of everything, but when I finally went back, things were a lot better. I have a degree in psychology, and I work at a rape crisis center now. I talked to a lot of young girls who were like me back then. Sometimes I think when I'm talking to them, this is what I was meant to do.
We studied over 500 children over a 15-year period, but only 25 of them had near-death experiences, and I studied them through the years to try to learn, what did they learn from it? And I heard one girl said to me, life is for living, and that light is for later. Another young man, by the time he was 25, he was running a small construction company. So I said to him, well, so what did you learn from your near-death experience? You know, what? And he says to me, very pompously almost, he goes, well, I learned I have a special mission in life. I learned that I've been touched by God to have a special mission. So I thought to myself, oh great, now he's going to tell me about, I don't know, he's going to run a church or whatever, or something like that. He goes, I have a job to do. Okay, so I said, okay, well, I was going to bite. This is when I was earlier in my career. I said to him, so tell me, so what is your job? Well, he was angry because he had already filled out all my preliminary forms and everything. He said, you know what my job is? My job is running a small construction company. I told you that.
The near-death experience is defined by the experiencer as a spiritual experience that brings them closer to the God of their being, that helps them to recognize and merge with their own soul, that shows them that they are part of everything and everyone on this planet and throughout the universe, and that it is up to them to hold that vision, to be that example, and to do what they can to make the world a better place.
And when I tell people what happened, the first thing they think is if I'm crazy or something. When they find out that I'm not crazy, the first thing they want to know is if I really believe in life after death. Well, I've seen it. I was there. I really believe that my life began after I died.
One thing is certain, sooner or later, we'll all find out what lies beyond death.